Hey everyone, Dr. L here with your week 10 video. I apologize that this one is going to be posted a little bit late. I was able to participate in a field trip that the social work program hosted, which they're part of our department. And so I was doing that all day Thursday, which is when I usually lesson plan. So I got a little behind on work. But without further ado, I'm going to start our lecture on stratification, focusing on gender. So I'll do housekeeping, review, lecture, exit paths, and reminders. I'm caught up with grading. Make sure you're paying attention to the individual feedback that I'm providing to you on the discussion posts. Know that if you don't have feedback on a given week, it means you earn full credit for that discussion post. Usually I tend to give feedback that's sort of individual based off of your post if I took points off because you were missing parts of the prompt or the rubric. And so to that end, make sure you're following along with the prompt and rubric when you are completing the discussion posts. Having them out in front of you can really help to ensure that you aren't missing any of the components. Also keep in mind my AI policy. So remember, you can use AI to help with grammar and spelling. If you think about platforms like Grammarly, that's a good resource. However, you can't use AI to think critically and creatively for your discussion posts. So that should be your own stuff. Midterm exam 3 is coming up next week, so make sure you are downloading the study guide and you're preparing for that. It'll be similar logistically to the previous two, and it will be primarily focused on the 4 chapters from our textbook that are designated in the course schedule. Of course, if you have anything you'd like to share with your classmates, events, clubs, things like that, feel free to email me and I will pass that along in next week's recording. All right, so to review, last week we focused on stratification, honing in on race. So racism is a set of attitudes, beliefs, and practices that are used to justify the belief that one racial category is somehow superior or inferior to others. Versus discrimination, which is prejudice action against a group of people. So sort of acting on those racist beliefs. Prejudice is biased thoughts based on flawed assumptions about a group of people. So oftentimes this is rooted in harmful negative stereotypes that often get perpetuated in things like the media and other social institutions. Now, when we start to see those things sort of permeate social institutions, that's what we call systemic racism, which is racism embedded in social institutions, also referred to as institutional racism and structural racism. Now, of course, we also have to think about how groups with historically privileged identities sort of operate as well within our society. So, sometimes when I'm talking about race in the class, students who are white may not necessarily want to talk about race, and they may think, oh, like race doesn't really relate to me. But everyone has a race, regardless of having a historically privileged or historically marginalized identity within that power dynamic. So very broadly throughout the semester, we've talked about privilege, but when we're honing in on race, we have to specifically focus on white privilege, which is the societal privilege that benefits white people or those perceived to be white over non-white people in some societies, including the United States. Now, thinking about the future in our class and thinking about this week's topic of gender, we can also think about privilege in that context, right? And so if we think about who has privilege when it comes to gender, it's men. They're the dominant group when it comes to gender categories. And we can think about how that type of privilege plays out in our society as well. And then, of course, we're reviewing intersectionality this week. So this is the term I choose to introduce at the beginning of the semester in almost all of my classes because it's very foundational to the field of sociology. But your textbook authors choose to include this term in the discussion that they have on stratification and race. And so make sure you're familiar with their textbook definition as well as mine. Here is my definition, which is the interconnectedness of systems of oppression, looking at race, class, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, ableism, sizeism, and other aspects of identities to answer questions about how these forms of privilege and oppression overlap and intersect. Now, so far when we've been dealing with stratification, we have honed in on race and class. Now we're going to be transitioning into talking about gender, sexual orientation, and gender identity. We don't really have an explicit chapter on ableism and sizeism. Hopefully you've seen how those terms sort of weave into the fabric of other topics we've covered so far. And then we'll also try to continue including social issues related to ableism and sizeism for the remainder of the semester. All right. As far as chapter 12 definitions, and I should say, especially since you're preparing for midterm exam 3, this is not an exhaustive list of all of the key terms from chapter 12. Rather, this is the list of terms that I choose to focus on for lecture purposes. So you are responsible for being familiar with all key terms from chapter 12 for midterm exam 3, as well as all the key terms from all of the chapters that are fair game for that exam. All right, so without further ado, when we're talking about stratification and gender, we have to first talk about sex and gender and what those textbook definitions are. Now, these are terms we talk about in our society all the time, but you may not necessarily know the textbook definition, right? Although I would say increasingly students come to sociology and other social science classes knowing the sort of basic difference between sex versus gender. So, sex is a term rooted in biology and most often based upon reproductive organs, which you'll notice this is a slightly adjusted definition from what is presented in the textbook, but I feel more comfortable with this definition. I think it's a little more clear than the one that the textbook authors provide. If you have any questions about that, feel free to email me your follow-up questions. Now, gender is a term that refers to social or cultural distinctions of behaviors based on one's sex assigned at birth. And again, that's a little bit tweaked from what the textbook authors present in this chapter. I used to always say, very basically when I would introduce this topic to my intro sociology students, sex is what you're assigned at birth and gender is the social constructs based off of that. However, that's something that students tend to often know already because of how this sort of discourse is playing out on social media and things like that. And so we can also start to think about how both sex and gender are socially constructed. And so there's a rich literature within the social sciences that looks at how, even though we think of biology and the natural sciences as being very much rooted in science, capital S, and this idea that those terms can't be socially constructed, in fact, they can. And there's a really excellent scholarly journal article from the late 1980s where the authors focus on the fact that when biology textbooks used in high schools refer to reproductive health, so when they talk about like the sperm and the egg and how life is born and contraception and stuff like that, actually it's done in very gendered ways. Like if you look at how the egg and the sperm are discussed in biology textbooks, the egg is described in very passive terms, which of course we know is very feminine ways of describing something, versus the sperm is described in biology textbooks as being very aggressive. And again, we know that that is rooted in a very stereotypical way of thinking about masculine norms. And so we can see how we sort of do gender even when we're talking about biology and sex. Intersex is people born with sex characteristics, including genitalia and chromosome patterns that do not fit typical binary notions of male and female bodies. So we often refer to gender and sex as being a binary, you're either this or you're that. But in reality, there is a spectrum of other identities that can exist. And so intersex is one of those things. We also have transgender, which is an adjective that describes individuals who identify with behaviors and characteristics that are different than their biological sex. And in a minute, on a later slide, I'm going to introduce to you a little chart that helps to break all of these terms down and what they sort of look like in real life. And you'll see that transgender also exists on a spectrum, similar to how sex and gender also exist on a spectrum. Gender identity is a person's deeply held internal perception of one's gender, and sexual orientation is a person's physical, mental, emotional, and sexual attraction to a particular sex, male or female. And again, that picture that I just mentioned will go over how this is also something that exists on a spectrum. Gender role, society's concept of how men and women should behave. And we know that these gender roles are socially constructed, meaning they evolve over time. So the way that our parents and grandparents understood gender roles is perhaps different than how we understand gender roles today. The way we understand gender roles in the United States might be different than in other countries, but there are some type of gender roles that exist in virtually all societies. Doing gender is the performance of tasks based upon the gender assigned to us by society and in turn ourselves. This is a theory that came out and was published on in the late 1980s, and it's something that continues to inform gender-related research within the social sciences. It's a theory that I've used in my own work, thinking about how college students who are engaging in risky behavior, like the physical fight stuff that I talked about earlier on in the semester, they do this gender when fights occur. They apply very gendered ways of thinking about physical fights based off of the gender of the people who are involved in those fights. Now, you all are going to be watching a documentary and writing a discussion post based off of that documentary this week called Misrepresentation. And so one of the things they talk about is the lack of representation in terms of gender when it comes to positions of power and leadership, especially with regard to elected officials. And so that gets us thinking about gender norms, and professions. And so on that note, the glass ceiling is an invisible barrier that women encounter when trying to win jobs in the highest level of business. We can also think about the glass ceiling in the context of other professions, including elected politics and things like that. The social construction of sexuality is socially created definitions about the cultural appropriateness of sex-linked behavior, which shape how people see and experience sexuality. And again, this is similar to like gender roles and doing gender and things like that. Heterosexism is an ideology and a set of institutional practices that privilege straight people and heterosexuality over other sexual orientations. Now, one of the things that I think is interesting about heterosexism is it can also impact how folks within the LGBTQ plus community operate in their everyday social interactions. So, for example, when we see a same-sex couple, there's an expectation that they want to get married legally, and they have that right at the national level in the United States now. But that requires a lot of money. Like, even if you don't want to have this big, expensive, elaborate wedding, you still at a minimum have to pay for the wedding, the marriage certificate and all of that, right? And so there are some folks, both same-sex and opposite-sex couples, who simply can't afford to get married. But this idea that same-sex couples should expect and want to get married legally is part of heterosexism. It's this idea that even if you're in a same-sex relationship, you should strive for sort of that heteronormative, we get married, we have kids, we have a family, we live in the suburbs with a white picket fence, right? And so be thinking about how we can challenge notions of what is normal within our society, and how we can embed a conversation around heterosexism, but also bringing in classism and the cost of being able to afford to get married and have a lavish wedding and all that stuff. And then finally, we have homophobia, which is an extreme or irrational aversion to gay, lesbian, bisexual, or all LGBTQ plus people, which often manifests as prejudice and bias. So we can think about how some of those earlier terms from last week, where we were honing in on stratification and race, continue to play out when we think of other categories of people with historically marginalized identities. All right, so I said I was going to show you an image that would help break down some of these terms and what they look like and how they exist on a spectrum. So this is the gender unicorn figure, and it shows us that gender identity, gender expression, sex assigned at birth, who someone's physically attracted to, and who someone's emotionally attracted to, all of these things exist on a spectrum and are not binary, despite the fact that historically, at least in the United States, we've really thought about these things as being binary. This also shows that while these things might have some connections, they are not inherently connected. So the way someone expresses their gender could be connected to their gender identity, their sex assigned at birth, who they're physically attracted to, and or who they're emotionally attracted to. But it doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be connected. So all these things could be connected or they could not be connected for any given individual within our society. And so that's why they aren't, that's why each of these different identity categories has their own set of arrows rather than having them all on the same spectrum. It's to demonstrate to folks that these things aren't necessarily connected, even though there are a lot of stereotypes that exist around these identity categories and what they're supposed to look like. right? So, in terms of gender expression, if you're assigned male at birth, you're supposed to express your gender masculinely. And if you're assigned female at birth, you're supposed to express your gender in a feminine way, right? But we know that that's not necessarily true. And so, even if we think about something as simple as whether or not an individual wears pants versus a dress, increasingly it's more and more common for women to wear pants even for formal occasions. But if we think about it as sort of old school way of thinking about fashion and gender expression, we can think about dress versus pants in that context. Now, I'm also going to take this as an opportunity to talk about plagiarism, because I know this is a topic that comes up all the time. And so often, we as professors have to talk about don't plagiarize, don't use AI to plagiarize. But students aren't the only ones who plagiarize, because anytime someone is taking content and passing it off as their own when they weren't actually the original creator, and they're not giving credit to the original creator, that's a form of plagiarism. And so I bring that up because when I first started teaching on gender and intro classes, there was another version of the gender unicorn. It was called the genderbread figure. And it looked like a gingerbread cookie, but instead it had all of this same kind of content on it. It was supposed to be cute, like genderbread instead of gingerbread. And people used it all the time when they were doing units on gender and sexuality in the social sciences. But then we found out that the person who had made that genderbread figure famous had actually taken it from somebody else and was not giving that other person credit for it. They had found it on the internet. They had become the one who got famous for it. They were the one people were citing, and in fact, it was not their own original content. So it's a cautionary tale that you can plagiarize anytime you take someone else's work and you pass it off as your own, and you don't give credit to the original creator. And it's not just students who plagiarize, right? Anyone who does that is in violation of plagiarism, and so I just want to point that out to you. All right. Don't forget to do your exit pass. As far as reminders, complete everything on our eLearn page for week 10, continue reading, complete chapter 12 quiz, do discussion 8 on misrepresentation, so you got to watch that documentary, start studying for exam 3, that study guide is now live. Have a great week, and I will talk to you soon.